Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We still have a number of people who are going to join. Let me change the view to gallery so it's the both of us. We still have a number of people. We have over 100 attendees who have signed up. So we'll still have a number of people who are joining us. But before we get started, let me do a brief introduction. So I'm Himal. I hope you have all been getting all of our emails. I'm founder of Quincia. We've been doing a lot of webinars on ATS systems, AI interviewing, and all these other technology topics. But once in a while, we get our hands on some esteemed leaders, and we are able to pursue them to be like, hey, come talk to us, share us your thoughts. So we were able to get Joe to, like, after a lot of convincing, to tell him to come and have a tech chat with me. So I'm very proud that as someone who I think is like really low on the scale, I get to interview you. So that's really good, cool. But yeah, before, obviously, like, a lot of people know you, as a thought leader in this space. They know you at University of Rochester, but I would love an introduction from you as to where you started, how you got to this place. That would be amazing for people to learn a little bit more about your background. So let's start there first.
Sure. No, I appreciate it. And it's I don't think you're low on the tiers below me or anything like that. I look at us as colleagues for sure. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate the invite and to be able to have a conversation. Love talking about the topics that we'll get into today, and just really having discourse about what's happening in the space around career education, higher education, especially over the last 18 months and what's sort of evolved. So appreciate being here. Looking forward to questions from the group. Looking forward to hopefully this being kind of sparking more conversation afterwards as well. But by way of introduction, I've been working in career education, higher education for about 20 years now. So honestly, ever since I left undergraduate, I grew up in New York, went to SUNY Binghamton as an undergrad. And I got my first experience in career as an intern working in the academic advising office as an undergraduate. And that was kind of honestly what opened my eyes to this as like a possibility, a thing of working in this space. So I started working at for-profit institutions after I graduated undergrad. And then off my career went, really. I kind of looked at different types of institutions, went to graduate school at Indiana University, where I really honed sort of my understanding of higher education, student affairs, really learned from some amazing professionals and people there when I worked there. And I really wanted to focus in on a couple of different topics: advising, career, equity and access was even really something I was really interested in back then because of my undergraduate background and some of the things I did as an undergraduate. So I've been working at private and public institutions ever since then. And really following one of the themes that came through, and which I think we'll talk about, has been technology. And it was kind of thrown into it because, when I was an undergraduate in 1996 or 7 or 8, HTML was becoming a thing. So I took a class on how to code HTML back then. So I was like the youngest person in my office as always, and people would say, can you just update our website? And so I was the person updating the website. I had no idea what I was doing. But I always loved that idea of technology. And I think I was always involved in it and on all the offices that I've worked in. So that's only continued to grow, especially as technology has become so prominent and such a significant part of the work that we do in career education. So it's been really a lot of fun to really kind of work at different types of institutions. And I feel like I've had such a range of super elite private institutions, selective institutions, large public institutions. And I think it's been interesting to see the themes that exist at all these schools, but also then the unique challenges that face some different institutions. So that's the briefer version of kind of where I've been in the institutions I've worked at and the areas. But obviously, I'm sure we'll get into other details as we continue our conversation.
Well, that's very interesting because, you mentioned that you were interested in technology before, and knowing knowing the little bit I know, like your university was one of the first ones to get onto Handshake. It was one of the first ones to get onto People Group, also one of the first ones to get on Quincia. So I can see that connection happening where it's more ready to adapt new ways or systems or technologies in that sense. So recently, you and Rose wrote a blog about technology and career services. Before we even get to what the blog is about, I want to get an idea of what, why did you even decide we want to write something? Sure. What was the motivation there of creating that?
Yeah, I think so Rose Nakamoto, who's executive director at Santa Clara University in California, we met through colleagues and a couple of different events that we had been attending. And so we were chatting and we were obviously observing what was happening during the pandemic. We've been following a lot of the things that were going on, especially around technology. And obviously all of us had to adapt fairly quickly last March to get on Zoom or to start using technology differently or move our operations completely virtual. And so I think for some institutions that was very jarring. To abruptly shift and change how they were going to serve students, how they were going to work with employers, how they were going to work with faculty, and so on and so forth. For others, challenging, but maybe not as dramatic of a shift because they were already kind of leaning into how to use some technology and how maybe they were operating. And that was very much true for our team here at the University of Rochester. We all had laptops. We were already practicing remote work and before that. And so but a lot of our colleagues around the university weren't. So we knew it was very jarring, and we've been observing and watching and seeing. And I think, throughout my career, the relationships we've had with technology companies, I think has always been really positive. I've always looked at it as a way to enhance the work that we're doing and add value. But I also knew that choosing those partners was really critical, and the people that work at those organizations, what their purpose was, what their missions were really important criteria for me to evaluate. So I think Rose had a very similar perspective on that. And so I think as we were examining and also tracking the conversations that were happening, and the idea that once the pandemic's over, we'll be able to return to the way we were doing things, and kind of that idea. I think we saw an opportunity to maybe just share our perspective on the idea. Maybe it's time to rethink, how we think about technology partners and organizations that provide services and products to us, and really sort of integrate that more fully into our strategies as opposed to a thing that you buy and just sort of add to the portfolio or put on the website. Taking a step further back and saying, if technology is not part of your strategy, integrated into your thinking, that's really going to be a problem moving forward for our field and for higher education broadly. And I think at a university level, I think many institutions are rethinking their IT strategies, their ed tech strategies, because they recognize that they have to be more ready for things like this in the future, having their faculty ready to think about technology integration, having students who are probably the more adaptable group to technology and how it's used. But what's the strategy versus a suite of things that's offered, and do those things speak to each other and really connect with each other? So I think our perspective was, here we're going to pose some questions and provide some outlines and thoughts, but also maybe a guide for folks to really think about how that strategy could benefit them in the future, and taking a step further back. Try to plan a lot with my team and all the places I've been. So for me, it's always about zooming out and thinking about the plan and a strategy to approach something. And I think technology needs that from a financial perspective, from a workflow perspective, but also from implementation time and integration into services that we're offering.
So that brings two big. I really like the fact that you go about with strategy before you go with technology, because I think that is like very crucial, because there are some technologies which obviously everyone should be using, but there are some which, if they don't have a strategy, they'll just fail.
Yep.
So coming back to the other thing you mentioned is the financial implication. Now, most universities have a smaller budget, especially when it comes to operating budget. NACE came out saying that, oh, 70% of career centers budget, or even more than that, goes into human and personal compared to technology.
Yes.
But even with that 70% going there, the student to advisor ratio is like 1,800 students to 1.
Yeah.
So do you think it is going to be technology that is going to bridge that gap, bring that in, or like, what is there going to be some other avenues?
I think it's layered, right? I think technology definitely will play a role in it for sure. And I think our budget, I think 90+% of our budget is personnel. So we have a pretty small operating budget. We fundraise, we generate revenue, and I think to offset that and to pay for technology or to get other people to pay for the technology at the institution. So it has to be part of the strategy. I think it's critical to scale. I think I hire it as a whole, and then career education as a component of that. We have to think about how to use technology to scale that, because we're not going to be staffed at a higher rate in the future necessarily. And we've doubled our staff at Rochester since I've been here. And then we probably hit the top peak of what that staffing is going to look like. So we have to start thinking about other ways to do that. Christine Cruz-Vergara and Farouk Day wrote an article a few years ago about, kind of what that future is and those 5 trends for what's happening. And one of the things they talked a lot about was integration. And I think that is probably the most critical piece of this, is how integrated is career education in the fabric of the university. And technology plays a significant role in that, but you have to philosophically and strategically get the institution on board with how it gets integrated, whether that's in the curricular experience, the co-curricular experience, the culture of the campus, and the dynamic of the campus. Those are really important pieces for it to be normed for when students arrive on campus, that this is just something that they do, and that their advisors, their faculty, their peers all know that this is an important part of the experience at a university. I think students and families know that, and they're asking those questions, and they're choosing institutions based on who's going to prepare them and help them achieve that mobility and that next step. But oftentimes we're not necessarily all integrated and in sync within our campuses. So I think that integration is going to be probably the most critical piece. And then technology allows for scalability, but I think each institution has to think about what aspect of their services are necessary to scale and what that's going to look like. And I think that's, each institution has to look at that, what their makeup is of their team, how many students they're serving, what kinds of students they're serving. Are they adult learners, or are they traditional age, 18 to 22-year-olds? Do you have a high number of first-generation students versus, not first-generation students? So all of those factors come in, because that does change those elements of how technology can play a role in being successful.
I think, you mentioned that, institutions have to look at their students in a particular way or anything else, and, who they're trying to serve. One of the critical aspects, what I personally would love, and I don't know, I don't have a response for it, but what I would love is more personalized service. So like every university has some portion of international students, some portion of first-generation students, some portion of minority students, some portion of students who come from really affluent backgrounds and whose parents are the first ones to ask what technologies you have. But all of those students require so many different needs. Like as an international student, I would have loved to have a webinar to explain how the H-1B process works, because it took me years, even after graduation, to understand it fully. But then I think that same content for, someone who is a domestic student or even a minority student might be completely irrelevant. A minority student might need a more, rather than putting technology, they might need more hand-holding to be like, why is it important for you to come to the Career Center or talk?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So in that sense, how do you structure your technology stack, or how do you structure your team such that when we talk about equity, it's not about just giving access equal to equity. It's about, look, we're going to provide personalized resources to build equity, because these students which are from, whose parents are telling them about technology and something, like they'll access technology, whether it's just on your website or whether it's in the class. For those others, we have to attract them. So how do you keep that balance? How do you manage it with staff?
I think a lot of it starts with mindset to begin with, and training of the team to start with, right? So I think, and from a mindset perspective, when I arrived at Rochester, we used to talk about, our work and what we were doing, and we use these generic term of like, well, all of our students believe, or all of our students think, and we had to stop that language, right? Because not all of our students thought that, not all of our, and we didn't know. And so we had to do some, user experience research and understand what those different populations actually needed and talk to the students themselves. But we had to stop thinking about students in a monolithic kind of identity, because they weren't. I don't know, at the University of Rochester, we have almost 30% international students undergraduate. We have 21% first generation students. So we have to, those are very different experiences coming to U of R. And I think what they wanted and their expectations and the needs that they had were very different. So the moment we stopped thinking about it from a students, writ large, I think allowed us to start thinking about what were those resources that we needed for those different populations of students. So listening, understanding what the students were, getting to talk to those students was critical, but also a reframe for our staff and thinking a little differently about it. And what are services that all students should have access to? Okay, we all want them on Handshake. We all want them accessing opportunities. We want them activated in the platform, because that's a good starting point. That's a way we can communicate with them. Great. But other resources then might be more specific or targeted based on what those gaps are. But we won't know that until we start actually finding out and listening to the students. I think a second piece of this, has to do with what services are already established for those different populations when we start thinking about these segmented populations. So for example, for us, international students, we have multiple offices that are built on our campus to support international students. What are the things that I can provide that office, or help retrain or cross-train those teams, so that they can start to introduce some of these ideas and topics? How mobilized are our alumni in helping our international student population? And even within international students, depends what country you're from, it's going to have a very different experience and a very different perspective on what it means to be studying in the United States, and what you want from this institution. So I think those are some of the sort of frameworks and mindsets that we have to start to shift, the training and getting our staff trained up on equity.
So did you have to divide your staff, or like help your staff be like, oh, you're going to be the sole person to coordinate with the international student office so that they are engaged? You're gonna like,
it was at both ends. So we had liaisons to units, but I think it was more important that all of our staff understood how to take a perspective that you have to just understand what the intersectionality of each student, and ask a lot of questions, because even if they're just an international student, that can mean a lot of different things. And so are we listening to those individual students? And so I think it goes to your question of how do you create a personalized experience and scale that, right? And I think that's where you're using and making sure your staff and your team is ready to be able to lean into that and create programs and resources and one-on-one experiences that are adaptable to individual needs and perspectives. But then also, is the technology we're using helpful to help discern that as well? Are we creating content that's specific to some of these populations? Are we letting students choose and opt in to what that is? I think one of the things we have to remember, and Rose and I touched upon this in the article, students are coming into university with a very in-depth technology experience, especially traditional age students, right? But even more and more adult learners that are coming to universities have been using technology in some way, or using apps and using different ways to find jobs or interact or build skills. And that goes for our high school students who have been learning, and the K-12 ed tech stack is even bigger than the higher ed tech stack. So I think that's an important thing to understand. And I think sometimes it's more of an adjustment for our teams and the people that work in universities than it is for students, because they're coming in expecting a level of customization, a level of personalization of content. Is the technology out there right now and to help us personalize some of that content? I think it's definitely shifting right now under our feet, but I think that's where technology can probably help. We can't take away the human element, which I think is still highly valuable especially on a university campus, traditional university campus as residential like ours. That human contact is key. They come here for that personalization, and I think they attend universities and they crave some of that. That being said, I think there's ways to really kind of take information and be able to, provide it to students and help them make decisions, make better decisions throughout their time. And is there technology to allow to help along with that, especially in populations that maybe this does not come naturally, or there's not necessarily affinity or experience with higher education in this area, or there are other obstacles that may exist for them to access some of these things. And I think the pandemic's only really exacerbated some of these inequities that exist, whether some of our students didn't have broadband access, or were coming from places where they had to figure out how to stay engaged with their academics and with their peers. We had to factor that into our equation as we were thinking about how do we best support and serve those students.
It was very coming personally from my background, like my father had no idea what a resume was. Being an international student in India, we never had a career center. So when I came to the US, like learning what to even write and explain, which most of my classmates already knew this. And I can just see that for, like, in our team, we have a couple of first generation students, and I can see whose parents have never told them go to a career center or do these things, compared to, and now with the pandemic, like they went back home. Most probably students from high social class, they still had their parents telling them, look, it's okay if you're at home, you still need to find an internship.
Sure.
But for the students from low social class who had not had that push from their family, I bet it was really difficult. What did your team do to engage those first generation students, those minority students to, like, is it more manual? Is it technology? Is it?
I think, we have a number of team members, including myself, who are first generation, college students. Growing up, my dad pretty much was going to go into business, which I didn't know what that meant. Law and medicine, those were like the options I thought were available to me. I didn't choose any of those three options. So I think it was very front of mind for a lot of the team. And I think we started with empathy, honestly. It's learning and listening to those individual students. And I think what we did was a campaign to reach out to students and just say, are you okay? What do you need? How's it going? What are the challenges you're facing? And we worked with colleagues around campus who might have been more tightly connected to some of these student populations that we're talking about, and find out what they were hearing and seeing from some of those students that didn't have good internet access, or were concerned about getting a job to pay bills or whatever it might be they're facing, and internship was the last thing on their mind. So I think we tried a variety of things, like most institutions, to try to meet those needs. A lot of outreach, individual outreach to students, especially our seniors last year, providing services and resources, and curating more information to say, hey, if you're going to look for building skills, here's a list of skills that might be really useful for you to build, and here's resources to go build those skills. Tableau, data, visualization, Salesforce certification, project management. Like, here's some things that might be really useful. And then we were able to say, and we're going to provide funding if you can't afford these things, and there's a cost to accomplishing those certifications. So I know all of these things are not always transferable to other institutions. And I think at the end of the day, though, it's really about listening and hearing what the students need, and then being able to best meet those needs by curating information and ways to do that. But each student's can be really different. And I think if they're engaged with your office and providing that insight, I think we as offices and as leaders in our fields are brokers, right? We're brokers of relationship, we're brokers of opportunities, we're brokers of resources. And how can we effectively help facilitate the students' interaction with that? Can technology help us do that? Help students practice those things and get access to those types of things? Do we need to make those introductions and foster some of that? Are we leveraging our alumni to do some of that work for us and mobilizing them? Are we training and helping to educate faculty and staff on campus to do some of that? I think our role is shifted And I think we have to continue to think about how we facilitate and broker their access to things, because we're the people, in many cases, in the career centers, thinking about this all the time. And we have to evolve our thinking, or continue to evolve our thinking, to stay very relevant to where students are at. And this year was challenging, right? And mental health, challenges that we're facing, a lot of our students, was higher than it's ever been in college campuses. And this was not an area that people were thinking about in terms of career, because they were just trying to manage and deal with health issues or family issues, just dealing with isolation, or in some cases being okay with isolation, but figuring out how to like maximize that time, because they were doing well. So that was a big concern, and we knew that this was lower on the priority, which is why, as we get ready for the fall, we're kind of readying for students that might have been absent from these conversations, and how are we ready to respond to those needs, or the feeling that they might have lost time and opportunity. And so I think that that's going to be, the empathy is going to be critical to us being able to manage that and help facilitate some of those connections.
So if you're going to spend so much time trying to facilitate those connections, and with only 24 hours in a day, how do you have your team say, look, I bet that the same mindset happened to your team, where your team was burnt out, your team was stressed, being at home. I know so many people who had trouble with family, with kids, obviously, at the same time. So how do you manage the team still being able to accomplish that?
Sure.
But still saving, like, do you cut on time? Do you cut on tasks? Did you decide, oh, this will be a change and focus from one-on-one to these things?
Yeah, I think last summer, the theme of our summer and our retreats and our time together as we planned for the fall 2020 was simplification. Let's break our job down to like sort of the basics, right? We know we can't do programming in person, so that's time saved to some degree. We know that we can't do, we're not traveling anymore, so we're going to be in the specific space for time being. So we try to simplify it and break it down to, we had a strategic plan. So what's the simplest version of our strategic plan that we wanted to execute? And I think we wanted to lean into working with students individually, but also working with student leaders who had influence on different groups and populations. That allowed us to scale, right? Supporting faculty as they were trying to transition. So it was spending and focusing our time in an area that we felt we could have bigger impact. And I think the outreach to students to make sure that they didn't feel like they had to reach out to us, that we were reaching out to them, was critical. The student leaders and the organizations was key too, because they had voices, with other students that we might not have had. But we also had to pay attention and tweak as we went along, because we knew by November, most of our students were burned out, let alone our staff. Like, they were just like, I'm not going to another Zoom meeting. I'm not going to another webinar. I'm not going, and I related to that for sure, because I was in this space for like 9 hours a day on this screen. So I felt them, I empathized with them as well. So we had to pay attention to what was happening and continue to listen and lean into that. But I think we just had to simplify our plan. But we had a plan to begin with, so it was easy to kind of go back to the plan and say, how do we make this a simpler version? How do we, really kind of lean into that? How do we mobilize alumni more to be conduits of that? Because I think some of our students were craving connection and access to things. So we have, a platform like People Grove that we were able to do that with. We have a platform like Handshake where we're able to, say like, here's access to opportunities, and opportunities alumni are posting specifically for you. And then we have, tools like Quincia that allowed us also to then say, practice on your own. Think about the time that you have and practice when you feel ready to, and use these tools. And then we're here to help when you need to process that. And so I think it was kind of thinking through that, but also simplifying what we were asking students to do, but also what I was asking my staff to do, to really focus in on some key areas that we knew would have the greatest impact individually, but also at scale.
Coming to the blog, for our attendees here, and I know it will be difficult to, but high level overview of maybe 2 or 3 things that from your blog you want every career center to think about when thinking about technology or technology partners or strategy when it comes to technology.
I think probably the number one thing that Rose and I were going for was just to take a step back and rethink, if you haven't done this already, how you view people that are technology partners, right? Because I think that's just a perspective and mindset of not thinking of it as just a service provider or a product provider, but a true partner, and what that means for your organization, and really evaluating that technology, understanding what the technology is supposed to do. And because I think a lot of times the misalignment of technology with offices is because sometimes there's just not a clarity as to what the product is, what the problem is that the product is trying to solve, and what you're wanting it to solve. Sometimes those things don't match. And I think that comes from a lack of understanding sometimes, and a lack of clarity around communication from both sides. But I think also we have a responsibility to ask different questions as well. So I think it's a rethink, it's a reframe of that. And I think the second element or ask is really digging into what are the actual problems you're trying to solve for your campus, and do you understand, and what technology might help you address some of those problems. That's, I think, is a really important starting point, to start to build a strategy and to start to build a plan. Because I think that's something that we've fallen into, and we saw something shiny and new as a technology, like, oh, we want that. We didn't know exactly what it was going to do. And we maybe took a little longer to evaluate it, or take a step back to say, well, what is this actually going to do for us? Like, what are we going to do with this? And are we ready to implement it in the way we need to implement it, and then evaluate it in the way it needs to be evaluated? So we put things on hold from time to time, because we weren't sure what the answer to those questions were. And we weren't sure if we were actually what problem we were trying to solve. So I think, to me, there's a piece of it is understanding the technology and what that relationship should be. But then there's also a part of, do you understand your own organization, and taking a step back and looking at what are the critical problems that you might have that you're trying to solve? What's the prioritization of those things? And I think that then helps to inform where the technology investment should go, because we have limited money. So we have to think strategically about where to invest that money in order to get that. And so a good example for us a few years ago was around alumni engagement. We didn't have anything that really allowed us to engage alumni in either a mentorship program or more based on identity or affinity. And so we worked with our alumni relations team to explore the products that were out there in the field, and find something that matched up to address the problem of giving students a way to identify people like themselves, in that they had ownership and agency to find those people, right? So it was really about the student finding those people that they wanted to connect with, that reflected their experiences, whether that was their major or their identity in different ways, their race, their ethnicity, where they were from. So I think that was a critical piece to us, and we picked up a product that we felt could help us do that, and that also shared the same value or philosophy of, like, that's an important thing that we're trying to solve for as well. And alumni relations was on board with that same approach, although their priority was a little different than ours. They wanted to provide alumni with an opportunity to give back and re-engage with the institution. So could we find something that helped us solve both of those challenges or problems? So it's a very specific thing. We didn't just want another network or community. We wanted really to help people find something that allowed them to resonate with them, and that was very personalized in some ways. So I think it's kind of those. I think those two things, I think, as a starting point, are I hope takeaways from what we wrote about. But I think this is the first foray into this topic that we're taking. And so I think we're going to probably get a lot of feedback, talk to a lot of people about these things, and probably write something else that kind of continues to follow this and track this conversation as it continues to evolve.
So as you follow this, and from the feedback that you've heard now that the blog has been out for a week or two, couple of weeks. What do you think is, from a career center, especially from a career, like from an entire university standpoint, but then narrowing it down from career center standpoint, where do you think, like, they should invest in? What kind of technologies, what areas they should be focusing on? And again, I understand it might be different for, like, oh, this is a big state institution, this is But like, there must be some common themes that you must be hearing after writing everything.
I think it is highly specific to the institution. And I think I always have the perspective that, I can come out and recommend a lot of things and tell you what to do. And I know I've been to plenty of conferences where people have told me like, here's the right strategy to go about doing these things. And I would sit there and be like, well, that doesn't really apply to me because I have this problem and this problem in my institution. So I think for me, it's always about asking better and more questions in order to understand that. So I think one of those areas I think that to explore is around recruiting and employers recruiting students. I know this is something that I know you think about. And are we providing tools to help students improve their likelihood to land jobs and internships because they're able to tell their story better, right? So that's one aspect of that entire early talent recruitment conundrum, right? But you have employers that are increasingly becoming more specialized in how they're thinking about this. They're becoming diversified in how they think about recruiting talent. They're thinking about, okay, should we really blow up our entire recruiting strategy? And I think the pandemic offered a window into doing that, right? Because before, like, here's my schools, I'm going to do my recruiting, and suddenly they can't go anywhere. So we should lean into this like virtual experience. And so now we're going to see how that shakes out for this fall. But I really feel like fall 22 is going to be when we're going to start to see a new version of this, because I think there's opportunities for cost efficiencies. There's opportunities for diversity hiring that I think employers, I think sometimes organizations that were out recruiting said things were important, but didn't always take action in the ways that would yield them access to their talent that they wanted. And I think using technology and different kinds of technology to access that is really key. How organizations work with universities to identify that talent, or are they going directly to students to find that talent? And I think we're seeing all of these things play out in the recruiting sphere. And I think that's really important to watch. And I think that's going to be a really big space for disruption over the next few years. Because as we're seeing every day, there's like this skill, finding people with the right skills to do the jobs. There's like 6 articles a day that I get in the morning for whatever newsletters I'm in that talks about skills gap and finding skills and early talent engagement and so on and so forth. So I feel like that's a space for sure that technology is going to play a massive role in, that continues to evolve. And you have many more players in it than just a university and a student. You have organizations, you have third-party entities, you have marketplaces, you have government agencies that are actively involved, economic development efforts that are happening, in cities and regions. It's happening here in Rochester. So I think that's a fascinating space with a lot of people involved in that. And what do we do in that space? How do we evolve in that space? But I think it's, once again, what are the questions you're asking? What are kind of the students that you have? What are the disciplines that are present at your institution? And how are you integrating that information in those organizations? And can technology help you do that to some degree? And I think, Quincia represents a portion of that. Handshake represents a different version of that. And People Grow represents a different version of that. So you have all these, players that have a role in this recruitment, early talent engagement, and exploration that's happening. And it's up to us then to figure out how that all fits together and how to kind of coordinate some of those elements.
I always like to, when I first started Quincy, I was always like, you can't clap with one hand, right? Like you can clap with a wall, maybe you can clap on a table.
Sure.
And for years, we've been trying to clap with just the employers. We've been telling them, look, your recruitment process is broken. The employers have been like, we can't find talent. And we have these two parties who've been trying to clap together all the time. And I think the pandemic, for the first time, provided a way, like in one of Farouk's vision chats, he was talking about how he went to employers and said, look, you could only find 6. That's not true. You can find all of them. Just rethink your process.
Yeah.
And I think that's great. But like, there are over 50,000, 60,000 employers, and how many employers can you go and do that? So there's also the other aspect where I think that you also have to tell the students, look, you have those skills, but you need to learn how to tell your story, how to communicate that story in a way that someone else will understand it and will value what you bring to the table.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm
And
curious, I would love to hear your perspective on, and I think equity and access plays a massive role in this, right? Because I think some of our students are coming to our institutions understanding what you're talking about and that concept. Others were responsible to help them, educate them into what that means and how to do that, and really think about what does social capital mean, what does social mobility mean, how do we provide them access to those opportunities, and how do we facilitate some of those efforts. So, as you're thinking about it from, your vantage point and Quincia, how do you think what you're doing helps, especially in that space of equity and access? How do you think that helps advance that? How do you think that helps, us institutions do that more effectively or better?
I think there are two aspects of it, the two ways to tackle it. The first one, I'll give an example. If you go to YouTube, you will now see everything that is curated at the top recommended for based on your history, based on very personalized aspect. One aspect is that where, as technology vendors, the more I think about it, I'm like, I want to provide personalized feedback, personalized resources to every student. Because even if you are a student who is from a high social background, you still might have different requirements where you might want to go in consulting, you might want to go in technology, you might want to go in entrepreneurship. And can we personalize that feedback for each student more and more? So one aspect is obviously providing that personalized feedback on career development, on their storytelling ability. And the other aspect I think about it, especially from an equity standpoint, is there are 24 hours in a day. If a typical person works 12 hours, there's only enough students you can engage with conversations. But what you can do is you can save your hours by helping some students self-serve and use that additional hours to go and outreach to those students who will never come to your office.
Yeah.
International students, first-generation students, minority students, they're the ones who are most engaged with their classrooms, their academics. They're the most engaged with thinking about, oh, I have this part-time job, I have to do this. And they're the most likely to drop out of college.
Sure.
And so, Myrna in one of our previous webinars said that the best way to engage everyone earlier is to get into college, get into the academics. And I think that is where we help, because I think as technology vendors, you're providing resources for students who can self-serve so that you have time to go and engage those students whose parents might not tell them you need to go to the career center, who might not even know what a resume is. So like in my head, I think the biggest role that will happen in the next 5 years, 10 years in technology is you'll see a lot of personalized, more like same platform, like same YouTube kind of, either it is content or it is feedback or it is storytelling, but it all will be, can we provide a personalized experience to each student to help them in that journey? And that just fascinates me, because it's like the technology is out there. It's just, can we use it for this aspect?
I appreciate that. I think one of the other pieces of this that of this part of the conversation around like equity access, I think that we've really grappled with as a team, and as someone who's a white middle class hetero male, I think this is very much front of mind for me, is what kind of bias already exists, right? For the work that we're doing. I think that's something that we've spent a lot of time on our team talking about, trying to find the right space for people to be vulnerable, but also really reflect on what they bring to the table. Because I think it's the whole idea about implicit bias, and the whole idea of these kind of hidden biases is that they manifest in different ways that we don't always realize, because it's so built into our systems and the way we work. And obviously, I know that this is something that you've thought about and talked about that extends to technology, right? Like that kind of naturally kind of extends to technology and thinking about that. So I know how to do that when I think about our team and how do we do that. We've done trainings, we've done, reflective activities, we've had speakers come in, we've had individual, kind of reflective exercises, and we built it into our professional development and our, one-on-one and our evaluations, and really kind of working. And it's an ongoing, process. It's not really ever complete. It's just an ongoing thing that's happening. So from your vantage point, I think the technology, can help with parts of these areas, but also there's this conversation that's ongoing because the technology is also evolving in my mind, right? Because it's continues to, grapple with the same topic. How do you see that continuing to evolve to address that element of bias that may exist, right? But also how we're, continue to help figure out how to do that collectively to solve for that.
I think bias in technology, and whether it is technology or human, it's the way I think about it is it's much easier in terms of technology, rather it is easier in terms of human. The challenge is, can you identify it? If you can identify that there's bias in technology, then it is very easy to remove from technology, because if you identify it, it's basically an algorithm. So you know which parameter, which metric, or which data point is going to cause it, and you remove that. With human, it's much difficult to remove that, but it's much easier to realize that there is bias. With technology, it is much difficult to realize or identify that bias, much easier to remove it. So the core, like the problem in both the things changes. If you're able to identify it, like there was back when first facial detection algorithm was being detected, and in 2015 or something like that, when we had the MIT researcher saying that, oh, this wasn't detecting colored faces, it was just detecting white faces because everybody else who was coming in was white. And once it was identified, it was a lot of effort taken to fix it, and it was fixed way quickly.
Sure.
But for the longest time, like for the last 20 years before that, we still haven't been able to fix the bias in like top management. Why is most CEOs all heterosexual white male? Why? And that's because it's not because we can't do that. I think we can do that. It's just, it took us data, it took us time to identify it.
Yeah, I think there's a level of awareness and self-awareness that needs to happen in all those cases, and accountability. Who are these various entities accountable to? And I think one of the outcomes from last summer is that we have to be more accountable to the different students that we serve in our institutions, and are we listening to all the voices, that are members of our community? And I think the technology falls in that category as well. Are we being accountable or held accountable to address that and really think about what that bias looks like? And are we self-aware enough to know that bias exists? I think that's the first part of this element is, do we recognize that there are systemic things that are happening? Do we recognize that the bias is embedded in some of the things that we do? And I think that's it's a process to work towards that, because I think the end result is always sort of evolving because we continue to learn. So I think that there is that synergy potentially between how technology continues to evolve, but also as we as institutions and we as leaders and people at organizations continue to have to invest energy into that space to think about what equity and access means as we go forward.
So as we go forward now that we went through 18 months of restructuring our entire teams, rethinking how we work, rethinking everything from scratch. I bet, I don't know, before the pandemic, how many times you landed up working out of your office here compared to working out of your actual office. But now that you've been there for like a year and a half, maybe, going back to campus, we hear from a lot of campuses that their advisors want a couple of days to work from home. What in your in your institution, maybe and again, it might be different for different institution. How are you planning to change the model? Is what's going to change for University of Rochester that maybe somebody could take away?
Well, I don't know if I doubt my boss will watch this. So like what my boss thinks might happen and what I think might happen might be two different things. So I think for me, I think we've asked this question, we've had these conversations with as a team and trying to figure out like what's worked and what hasn't worked over the last 18 months. I feel like we've been really productive in certain aspects of our work and able to stay connected with each other and able to find balance in some cases. So we've had a lot of conversations individually and collectively as a group. I think the biggest element for us, and I think we're a private residential university, where 90+% of our students live on campus for the majority of the time that they're here at the university for our undergraduates. What are they going to want? And I think what they want in September might be very different than what they want in November, it might be different than what they want next February. And so I've told my staff that we'll start the semester a certain way. We're going to ask and listen and see what the students are telling us, and then we're going to adapt that as we go along. I think we're going to have a fluid, flexible schedule. We're going to have people working remotely and working from home. And if students say, I'm good with advising being virtual, but I want employers and alumni, I want to meet them in person, I want to, engage with them and network with them in person, then we're going to move to that model. If they say, I want to meet my advisor in person, because that's really important to me, and to do that, and I could do, virtual career fairs all day long. Okay. So I think we might know, but we have to see how a lot of this shakes out. Like I said earlier, I think fall 22 might be the real test of a lot of these learnings that we have. I think some institutions are really trying to snap back to what it was pre-pandemic. Other institutions are saying, virtual is here, so we're going to do a lot of things virtually. I think it depends on your campus, depends on the expectations, it depends on what your model is for your delivery of education. But for us, I think we're going to start in a little bit of a hybrid space. We have a lot to learn because we knew how to do things in person. We knew how to do things virtually. I don't know if we really know how to do things hybrid. And that's just an honest assessment of, and we're going to do trainings of our team to run a meeting in a hybrid way. I don't know. We've done it before pandemic and they never really went very well. So I think the question is going to become, can we do that effectively? If we can't, that should be an indicator, because at the end of the day, it's about the user experience. It's about our students, it's about our team and their ability to be effective and have impact. So I think we're going to learn a lot this fall, honestly. And so I think for me, I'm setting up a very loose structure of some guardrails, some expectations for what I want us to see. And then we have to lean in and hear and listen, watch the rhythm as the fall semester breaks out, because they might want to be in class in person, but they might not want anything else in person. They might just want to be together themselves in person, because we restricted them to gather and do things in student organizations and play sports. Like they couldn't do any of that last year. And that's maybe why they come to Rochester, to do those things with their peers and maybe not necessarily with their faculty or with us as career advisors. So I think we're going to learn a lot in the fall, and we didn't survey them in the spring because we didn't think it was going to be very effective to ask them in May what they think they're going to feel like in August, when we didn't have a lot of answers ourselves. Like just yesterday, the university started releasing plans for masking and vaccinations and things like that for the fall. So this is in formation over the next 2 months. We're going to learn a lot. New York State's 70% plus vaccinated. Rochester is 70% plus vaccinated. But our students some of them are stuck abroad. Some of them are in other parts of the country. We don't even know who's going to show up in the fall, frankly, because of regulations and visas and things like that. So I think we're going to have to do things hybrid. We're going to have to do things virtually still, because some of our students may not be able to show up. And then there are other students that are going to show up and want to engage and re-engage in person. And I think we have to be ready for that as well. So I think it's going to be fluid. And I think that's something I think my staff maybe didn't really want to hear. Like they wanted just kind of more definitive plans, like we're going to do this and this is how many days you're going to be in the office and this is how many days you're going to be out of the office. But I think that's unreasonable, honestly. I think we have to really adapt and kind of be responsive. So we're going to have a structure, and then we're going to kind of meld it depending on what's happening, what we're hearing, what we're seeing. But we'll put some guardrails on it, at least to start the semester.
So there's a very interesting question here about how are you, when you say this, and you've said this multiple times during the conversation, that you're hearing from the students, you're hearing from the staff, you're listening to their needs. Are you using technology to do that? Is it more you're on the ground? Is it more based on, the number of students coming in or attending events? Like, where is that data coming from that is helping you make these decisions?
Sure. I think we will survey the students, so we'll send some questionnaires out attached to, if they participate in services, then a follow-up, kind of survey, like, hey, would you do this in person? Would you do this virtually? What's your experience? What are you looking for? So I think as an office, we'll do that. As a university college, we're probably going to be asking them some of those questions. So we're going to coordinate those efforts. What are we doing? What information can we collect from students, and what is the university collecting? We're going to do focus groups. We're going to talk to student leaders. We're going to host student leaders in our office and ask them those questions and try to gauge that to some degree. We're going to talk to our colleagues in other offices that are responsible for different populations. So we have an office that works with first generation students. What are you hearing from students? What's critical? Like what do they want in person versus in not in person? So we're going to we have liaisons to all these departments. We're going to leverage some of that, and then we're going to track utilization, right? What are students opting into? So this was a funny conversation we had with our staff a few weeks ago. They said, well, if students choose, Handshake released, an opportunity for students to choose virtual, appointments versus in-person appointments. So basically they're like, so if they choose in-person, does that mean I have to come into work? I'm like, well, yeah, I think that's kind of the way it works, is that the students are going to dictate what we do more than anything else. But I think it led to a really interesting conversation that let's let the students, let's offer them everything they need to offer. Let them decide what they're choosing, right? And I think part of it is defaulting to being present and being available. And then if students start choosing a lot of virtual experiences by like virtual appointments, then we might offer more of those, right? If they're starting to offer them, if they want them at night and we're not offering them at night because they got used to that because we were offering it, over the pandemic, we'll do more of that. So it's following their path, the old adage, you have like the green space, and where the paths, students walk will be where the paths are laid out. I think we're going to do a little bit of that as well. So it's probably a combination of a variety of things. I think for a residential campus, I think there's going to be a little bit of a kickback potentially for students if they want to do more in person. But I don't know if it's going to be for our office and our service. That's why I keep reminding people around campus, like, yes, that's probably true with each other and with maybe some of their faculty, but I don't know if that's going to be with our office. So we're going to have to evaluate that and pay attention to that. So surveys, focus groups, listening to our partners and liaisons around campus, and then watching what they're choosing to partake in, I think are all going to factor into that. And we're going to see if that changes depending on what time of year it is. We might see a spike in August, September, and then a drop off as October and November come, that they might opt to do more virtual stuff. We're in Rochester, New York. It's cold here in November.
I was about to say, you can't tell a student to walk around in the snow.
So they might not want to do that, So I think we're really going to pay attention to what that looks like, if it's convenient, if it's the preferred way of interacting. So this year is going to be like a lot of experimentation, I feel like. And so I'm trying to ready my staff for that experimentation and that fluidity.
So how do you think about your technology partners for that hybrid, that fluidity for, the next, year? Because like you said, like fall 2022 you might have some idea of how things are, but the next 12 months will be a lot fluid. So what technology partners do you like? Is Zoom going to be more restrictive, to be like, we are only having Zoom meetings with students but not internally? Or is Zoom still going to have its stock continue going up?
This is a good question. I don't know. I think with the in terms of our evaluating our technology partners, I think the key question is going to be is, once again, what problem are we looking to solve for our students? And now a new question that we should be asking is this something that they want to engage in virtually or not? What is this product or service that's going to allow us to do? So I think with virtual practice and feedback for resumes, we thought that was a really effective way to do that before the pandemic, right? Like we thought we could scale and use the technology. We just happened to roll it out in the middle of the pandemic, but we were kind of already thinking like this is a great way to help students be more self-directed and help them and maximize our time when they do show up in our office and for advising or programs or whatever it is. So I still believe in that. I think we have to think about technology and figuring out, is this something that students want to engage in? So for us, we always involve students in all of these decisions because we want their feedback. We want, like, is this something that you want to do? Is this something you're going to engage with? So their voice is critical in a lot of these conversations in order to allow us to figure out, like, does this have legs? Because I'm mid 40s kind of Gen X kind of guy. What I think is cool or what I would do is not what they want to do. So I have to sort of, once again, check my own perspective on these and make sure that their voice is part of our decision making.
That's pretty awesome. Well, I am glad we are going to be a partner with you for the next 12 months, and we'll help you in that transition. I always say that it's a world in, you wrote your first HTML code in college. My first laptop was way after college. But then, like, my father still does not understand what I do for work.
Yeah.
And I never understand when I meet someone who is 18-year-old, when they, talk in language that or use apps that I have no idea even existed. So, so it'll be a very interesting next 12 months to understand and help students in the best possible way.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. This was immensely entertaining and helpful, and I bet everyone in the audience got a lot out of it.
Well, appreciate the time, Hamal, and look forward to future conversations, and thanks for everyone that was able to attend as well.
Awesome. Well, have a great rest of the week. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, take care.
Bye.